everyone, welcome to Tutorial 7. Another long-term control on Earth's climate system, in addition to orbital cycles, is the carbon cycle. In particular, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere influences Earth's climate through the greenhouse effect, such that increased atmospheric CO2 contributes to warming and decreased atmospheric CO2 contributes to cooling. Today, anthropogenic sources of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are causing a rise in atmospheric CO2 concentration, contributing to the warming. However, throughout Earth's history, there's been natural variability in atmospheric CO2 due to changes in the natural carbon cycle. And these changes contributed to past climate changes on longer timescales throughout Earth's history. In this tutorial, we'll explore some of the processes involved in the carbon cycle, and we'll think about current and future climate change in the context of these longer-term carbon cycle variations. So carbon on Earth in different forms is cycled through various reservoirs through various processes. This diagram on the left is showing a schematic of some of these mechanisms. And some of the major reservoirs of carbon on Earth include the biosphere, the atmosphere, soils, and the ocean. And there's a handful of different processes by which carbon is transferred between these reservoirs. For example, a transfer of carbon between the biosphere and the atmosphere can occur through photosynthesis and respiration. A transfer of carbon between the biosphere and soil can occur through respiration and microbial decomposition. And a transfer of carbon between the atmosphere and the ocean can occur via air-sea carbon exchange. However, on longer timescales, tectonics plays a role in the inorganic carbon cycle. For example, some sources of atmospheric CO2 on this longer-term carbon cycle include degassing from volcanic emissions and spreading centers. For example, as tectonic plates converge and volcanic arcs form, this can produce an input of CO2 from these volcanic emissions into the atmosphere. In terms of spreading centers, as tectonic plates diverge, this results in input of CO2 to the ocean and then to the atmosphere by way of the mantle. And in addition to having sources of CO2 to the atmosphere, this long-term carbon cycle related to tectonics also has sinks of atmospheric CO2. For example, silicate rock weathering is a sink of CO2 because the process by which silicate rocks weather involves removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. Additionally, this long-term carbon cycle acts as a sink for atmospheric CO2 through the process of carbon burial. So when fluxes between the atmosphere and other carbon reservoirs on Earth are balanced, the amount of carbon stored in these reservoirs will be constant. However, changes in the fluxes between reservoirs can cause an imbalanced cycle that affects Earth's climate. For example, if there's more CO2 put into the atmosphere, Earth can warm, and if more CO2 is removed from the atmosphere, Earth may cool. So let's take a look at some specific examples of how an imbalanced carbon cycle can affect Earth's climate. One example is increased vegetation growth. If there's increased vegetation growth, there'll be increased photosynthesis, which results in more removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. As a result, this removal of atmospheric CO2 from the atmosphere reservoir to the biosphere reservoir would result in an overall cooling on Earth. Another example we can look at is the effect of anthropogenic emissions on Earth's carbon cycle. So in this scenario, anthropogenic emissions are producing increased atmospheric CO2 due to increased fossil fuel burning that releases CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So in this scenario, there's a transfer of CO2 to the atmosphere. So this increase in the CO2 reservoir in the atmosphere would result in warming on Earth. And this is an example of how anthropogenic influences are altering the natural carbon cycle on Earth and natural climate variability in general. And there are multiple sources of anthropogenic CO2 emissions. The graph on the left is showing the amount of CO2 emissions each year from land use change, oil, gas, coal, and other sources. And since 1980, anthropogenic sources of atmospheric CO2 have continued to increase. The figure on the right breaks down land use change a bit further and shows results from model simulations of the impact of land use change on atmospheric CO2. The blue, yellow, and green lines are model simulations of global CO2 emissions from land use change, and the black line is the average of these three models. The gray line and shaded region are the mean and range of global CO2 emissions from land use change, as simulated by 16 dynamic global vegetation models. These anthropogenic sources of CO2 emissions have resulted in a rapid increase in atmospheric CO2 concentrations and an associated rise in global temperature. These graphs highlight the impact of anthropogenic CO2 on atmospheric CO2 concentration and global temperature. The global temperature anomaly graph contains the annual average as well as the 5-year average of the data. Running averages, such as the one shown here, can help to visualize climate data time series and assess long-term trends. For example, in this case, shown on the bottom, there's some variability annually seen in the original temperature record, but when we look at the 5-year average, we see a longer-term trend of increased warming over this time. In this tutorial, we'll learn how to use running averages and other computational tools in Xarray to help us interpret climate data.